Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to my journey across the United States, where every state has a story, and Arkansas, you have some proper strangeness. Today we're covering everything from a war between a couple of churches to caves filled with ancient civilizations. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss this deep dive into some of your state's strangest stories. Now, before we jump into these stories, I have a quick favor to ask. If you enjoy these deep dives into America's strangest tales, dropping a comment and a like, and smacking that subscribe button like it just transferred to UCLA in the spring transfer portal, leaving behind both Tennessee and Arkansas in crappy situations, will help me out more than anything as I struggle my way up this hill towards 100,000 subscribers in 2025. This will never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyways, with that, let's get into Arkansas's weird lore. If you thought the mine wars of West Virginia were a heck of a saga, man oh man, wait until you hear about that time in Arkansas when a comedian turned preacher managed to rile up a town so much that even his own one-time followers began to bear arms and fight. Think of it as something between an episode of WWE SmackDown and a Bible study. This is the story of the Arkansas Church Wars. To start, it's worth noting that this saga is scarcely documented, and the entire affair is pretty much entirely documented in some records detailing the crimes committed and in some writings on the subject by Dusty Jordan, informed by just 4 locals. These tales from the locals are actually the only documents that we have that have helped us get to the bottom of why this whole saga was ongoing. But no matter what source material you reference, you're pretty much bound to conclude that at the center of all of these shenanigans was a man named Joe Jeffers. This saga begins with him when in the 1930s in Jonesboro, in Craighead County, Arkansas, Joe Jeffers, an actor and comedian who transitioned to being a traveling evangelist because naturally the career path from open mic night to messenger of God is a straight line, was actually invited by the local First Baptist Church and the Jonesboro Bible College, and he began to hold meetings, revivals of sorts, in a tent, the first of which took place on June 29th of 1930. He did this a few times over the next couple of months. And then something happened that would blow this whole thing up. The pastor of the First Baptist Church, Pastor A.W. Reeves, would opt to resign, and that meant an election would be held for his replacement. And who better for this replacement than the popular newcomer, Jeffers? He, of course, would be elected in a controversial style, with many, at least according to the sparse available records, claiming that the majority of the congregation was left out of this vote. In short, it was a controversial move from the start. This meant that a lot of the congregation protested, and Jeffers pretty much immediately had to take a step back from his new role while they worked out a solution, and instead, perhaps more fairly, elected Pastor Dow H. Hurd from Big Spring, Texas. Jeffers, meanwhile, likely scorned, took his ministry elsewhere, if only for a moment. Just a year later, though, he'd return to Jonesboro and start holding more revival meetings. Like a proper pot stirrer, Jeffers is recounted to have included nothing but inflammatory material in these new sermons. First, he warned that the end of the world and Jesus' second coming were imminently on the way, because nothing gets a crowd more fired up than a sweaty man screaming about a second coming, which coincidentally reminds me of a friend's story about a Tinder date. And second, he would throw his adversaries under the bus, claiming that Dow H. Hurd, the man that had been elected instead of him, was an immoral man. He also made similar accusations about the then mayor of Jonesboro. Of course, you can't just stir the pot forever and not expect it to boil, and on September 9th of 1931, the first physical violence of this conflict would occur. And this is gonna make me laugh, but there was a brawl at the friggin' First Baptist Church between the camps of Jeffers and Hurd. Some people catch the Holy Spirit at church, but these folks caught hands. Goodness gracious, Jesus must have wept. This resulted in the arrest of a supporter of Jeffers, and then the intimidation of the courthouse employees by followers of Jeffers the next day, including a ridiculous moment where Jeffers apparently prayed that God would strike down the mayor and when God didn't immediately act, Jeffers' crew would take matters into their own hands and go all jump thy neighbor, going after the mayor and police chief in broad daylight. This resulted in the governor catching wind of this drama, and literally soldiers were sent for 5 days to keep the peace in town and watch over Jeffers' tent. Of course, as soon as they left, someone would drop tear gas outside of his tent. And of course, one side was saying they did it, and the other side was saying false flag faster than a Facebook group during election season. And then, over the next month, Jeffers' tent would be burnt to the ground at some point, and a bunch of Jeffers' followers were kicked out of the First Baptist Church. But for Jeffers, this was hardly a big deal. By this point, the man had gained thousands of followers, so he had the funds to build a proper church, naming it the Jonesboro Baptist Church. He was basically the new Joel Osteen of backwoods Arkansas, minus the teeth whitening. Now, just when he started to look like an unstoppable force, Jeffers would again decide to leave town, placing Pastor Dale Crowley of Denton, Texas in as his replacement. But like that cat you thought wandered into the woods and died a year ago, he'd sneak right back in the front door of that church later on. This time, he claimed that he had shook off his fundamentalist streak, and once again, now he and the man he appointed were at odds with one another. They'd even apparently hold services at the same time, with their choirs singing in unison. And on August 14th of 1933, this almost resulted in a friggin' gunfight. And at least at this point, the men decided, hey, you know what? Maybe we settle this in a more civilized manner. And they went to the courts, who sided with Crowley. And I'm sure now that they made this a civil matter and stuck it to the courts, everything settled down, right? Well, oh boy, I've got some bad news. Literally one day after this, Crowley, the other pastor, decided to do something super reasonable. He went to the church, which he'd just been awarded in court, to claim it. And of course, one of Jeffers' men, or potentially someone they hired, was there protecting the church. And he'd get into a shootout with the freaking pastor. I don't usually say the Lord's name in this manner, because I know a lot of folks don't like this, but this moment is deserving of a chesty billowing, Jesus Christ. Luckily, turns out the pastor and his bodyguard were crack shots, so they sent that guy straight to the big man in the sky. But this event did result in Crowley's brief arrest, during which there was an attempted assassination attempt on him that failed, and Crowley was eventually acquitted. Now, finally after this, that scoundrel Jeffers would leave. He moved on to other cons. First, he went to Miami, Florida, becoming a leader of a fringe spiritual belief system that combines elements of pyramid energy theories with a reverence for Yahweh, often asserting that pyramids possess divine or supernatural powers aligned with biblical or metaphysical interpretations. Yeah, really weird stuff. And then he'd go on to claim to be a prophet in Missouri. Regardless, my understanding is that after Jeffers passed through, bickering went on in this community among members of various factions for decades. It's one of those stories where the less you know, the more your brain is protected, but God bless Arkansas for giving us this chaotic slice of fried history. In this series, we've covered a handful of places with extremely strange names. But the small community of Toadsuck, a bit northwest of Little Rock, may very well take the cake at this point. Toadsuck is an unincorporated town in Perry County, and frankly, this entry is going to be a short one because it's not really remarkable in any way, shape, or form, other than the fact that the town has a strange name and an abundance of signs that advertise it is very much named Toadsuck. Luckily though, Toadsuck does have some variety of a story for how it got its name at least. If you go to the town website, it actually explains that the meaning of the town's name harks back to when steamboats traveled up and down the Arkansas River during certain times of the year, when the water was deep enough that they could actually pass through without beaching. But the thing is, sometimes as these steamboats passed through, the water level would drop a bit, and the rivermen aboard these boats would find themselves beached. This apparently happened frequently near the modern-day Toadsuck, especially close to where the town's lock and dam span the river, and they'd basically tie up their boats and, I quote, suck on the bottle till they swelled up like toads. In other words, these rivermen would get good and drunk while they waited for the water levels to rise. So anyways, this is what I'd throw into the bucket of novelty towns for sure, but if I ever find myself traveling near Little Rock, I'll be sure to drop down to Toadsuck and grab a soda at the Toadsuck One Stop, I suppose. Thanks for being weird, Toadsuck. The story of the Gow Row first clawed its way into the public imagination through the pages of the Arkansas Gazette on January 31st of 1897. It was Elbert Smithy who penned the tale, but the true star of this strange saga was a Little Rock businessman named William Miller, and the beast he claimed to have hunted deep in the Ozarks. Miller had been traveling through the rugged wilderness of northwest Arkansas near the small township of Calf Creek when he began to hear troubling stories. Something big, had been snatching up livestock in the night. Locals whispered about a monster, and Miller, a man known for action over speculation, took it upon himself to investigate. According to his own account, it wasn't long before Miller came face to face with the creature. It emitted a low, guttural sound that chilled the blood. Gow Row. Gow Row. A sound that would forever be tied to the beast. Miller tracked the Gow Row to its lair, a cave that stank of death. Inside, his hunting party discovered bones, some unmistakably human. Determined to end the creature's reign of terror, they set an ambush out near a nearby lake. As the sun dipped below the trees, they heard a violent commotion, and they knew it was coming. What followed was chaos. The beast erupted from the brush like a living nightmare, tearing trees down from their roots and dismembering one of the hunters before the group finally brought down the Gow Row. They would then describe this creature as a creature of nightmares, 20 feet long, tusked, and horned, with webbed, clawed feet, a row of spiny protrusions down its back, and a tail tipped with a jagged blade. Once it lay dead, the body was reportedly packed up and sent to Washington, D.C. But here's where it starts getting funny. Curiously, the Smithsonian never confirmed receiving this Gow Row body. Regardless, years later, the story didn't die. In fact, it grew. Ozark folklorist Vance Rudolph noted similar sightings as early as the 1880s. He collected tales of the Gow Row's biology, how it laid eggs the size of beer kegs, and carried its young in a pouch like a kangaroo. One memorable tale came from Boone County, where a caver exploring Devil's Hole swore he encountered one 20 feet below ground. Another account told of a man who lured a Gow Row out with dried apples out of this aforementioned cave, fattening it up until it couldn't squeeze back into the cave. He allegedly put it on display, charging a quarter for a peek. And of course, every single time someone gave him a quarter, it would escape, and he'd tell the crowd, and that would send the crowd into a panic, and they wouldn't want their money back. If you read old Arkansas newspapers, you'll find tales of this Gow Row scattered throughout them, and it's good fun. But the question is the Gow Row actually real? Well, sadly, probably not. Modern historians and skeptics alike point out that nearly every story about the creature was printed in newspapers at a time when sensational tales sold more papers. The Gow Row was likely a fabrication, a fearsome, fictional beast dreamed up for attention and amusement in an era before internet clickbait. But truth or not, the Gow Row has earned its place in Arkansas folklore, because sometimes the best stories aren't about whether something actually happened, but whether it could have. And trust me, if I'm ever mountain biking through the woods in Bensenville and I hear Gow Row, I'll be turning around and biking back to town. Okay, I've got huge news for you. In Carthage, Arkansas, there's a tree in Hampton Springs Cemetery. You can go home now. No, just kidding. There's actually something that some say is remarkable about this tree. See, if you look closely at it, you'll see near its bottom there's a very non-tree-like feature. A bunch of bricks. Now that's kind of strange. I wonder what this could be. Well, if you inspect a bit closer, there's markings on these bricks. Writing. Huh. Of course, with something this strange, there's always a legend, so let's tell it. As the story goes, this tiny cemetery was once stewarded by a tree surgeon, who kept all the trees here nice and tidy and made sure that, if he caught it early, he could save trees from any ailment plaguing them. That being said, as folks do, this tree surgeon got old, and just before he passed away, he made a request that he be buried inside of his favorite tree in the cemetery. Thus, when he died, they stuffed him up in there, bricked over the opening, and called it a day. And over time, the tree grew around these bricks in the opening they made, and thus it was only fitting that his tombstone be one of the trees themselves. These days, they say you can still see evidence of this grave, given in the bricks, there are slight markings visible, which some say were once his makeshift headstone. So, applause from me. Fantastic tale. But is it true? Is there a man buried in this tree, and is he going to start piloting it one day, like some sort of kaiju int, becoming Treebeard or something? Well, probably not, because the reality is there isn't even anyone buried inside of this tree. To start, this tree is pretty tiny, as is the hole, and at normal tree growth rates, there's pretty much no way this hole ever would have been big enough for it to fit a person inside of it. Also, as for the markings on the brick, well, these markings are actually pretty much in line with some name and date denotions frequently used in the nearby timber industry. So more likely, these markings are just someone saying, hey, this tree belongs to me. Therefore, the more likely case is this story is made up, and in actuality, at one point this tree developed some rot or something, and the folks didn't want it to fall over on the other tombstones, so they probably filled it with cement and called it a day and bricked it up. So that's the story. Sadly, it's not very fantastical, and rather is a perfect combination of circumstances that made this tree fit in a little too well with the headstones around it. Case closed. Okay, so if you remember back to my Oklahoma video, we covered a story, that of the Fouke Monster, which I pronounced the Fouke Monster, so sorry about that, or the Boggy Bottom Monster. And today, given I sort of whiffed and ended up telling a story about an Arkansas cryptid in my Oklahoma video, I'm going to tell this story again, but in the correct video. Regardless, I should note these two creatures, the Oklahoma and Arkansas variant, are largely considered to be one and the same, or the same species at the very least. So I'll at least do you the pleasure of telling you the Oklahoma story alongside the Arkansas story here. Allegedly, the earliest sightings of this creature are from 1851, when reports of a hairy creature were circulating in the Memphis Inquirer, and in 1856 when they were reported in the Caddo Gazette. Generally speaking, these reports were short and sweet, with locals reporting a creature that wasn't so much a beast as a weird-looking man, saying they saw someone of gigantic stature and a hairy body, as well as with long locks of hair. Some other reports described him as a 6-foot-tall and hairy, stout, athletic-looking man that was as fast as a deer. One report actually told of a wild man that had attacked a hunter, damaging his eyes in the process, and even biting a chunk out of him before, I kid you not, stealing the hunter's horse and riding away, which, frankly, is a hilarious own on that hunter. Let me know if Bigfoot has ever stolen your car in the comments below, because that would be even better. The first reported modern sighting that fits the Oklahoma rash of sightings that are nearby, and perhaps the worst known account of the lovingly named Boggy Bottom Monster, is from 1942, when two sisters observed a large hairy creature run from them on a spring evening. This event supposedly happened in Clear Boggy Creek in Oklahoma, where he basically just waded his way through the water, caught glimpse of these onlookers, and took flight. The better-known first report of this creature, though, is from the 1970s, when Bobby and Elizabeth Ford, two locals of Fouke, Arkansas, in May of 1971, reported that they and some friends were crashing in a house they'd recently moved into, and Elizabeth looked out the window to see a huge, hairy beast reaching through an open window towards her. Now, as you'd do in this situation, she screamed her head off, and the young couple intelligently decided it was time to move, only days after they'd moved into this home. This report was actually chronicled to one journalist, Jim Powell, who wrote about the creature in the Texarkana Gazette and the Texarkana Daily News, and gave it the name, the Fouke Monster. According to this hilarious monster movie-like account of the event, Elizabeth basically saw the curtains move and thought a bear was reaching inside, which very much may have been the case in reality, and screamed, sending it darting away. But afterwards, it lingered behind the house for a while. Then they shot at the creature a few times, but apparently they didn't get it because following this account, there were many subsequent sightings of the beast in the local community. This whole episode actually inspired a movie by one Charles B. Pierce in 1972 called The Legend of Boggy Creek. The movie was a docudrama and the 11th highest grossing film of 1972, becoming a cult classic nowadays, which honestly I need to watch this weekend. The movie actually incorporated a bunch of locals in it too, I suppose to offer the story more credence. In the midst of all of this, I think it's worth noting that one very local family was a family by the name of the Crabtrees that had apparently been dealing with the Fouke Monster for nearly a decade at the time of the 1971 encounter, but strangely, only had the gall to report their claims after the 1971 encounter. The patriarch of the family was named Smokey Crabtree. He had the name of a man's man, and he actually leveraged his position of having dealt with the creature to be a backwoods guide for Charles Pierce as he was filming the movie about the creature. And apparently the rest of the family was also included, even getting a song about the Crabtree family's son, Travis, included. I'm not necessarily saying they made all of this up, but I will say their rise to fame was certainly not something they tried to avoid, and the timing of their inclusion in the story was convenient, to say the least. Smokey also wrote and published a book aptly titled Smokey and the Fouke Monster, in which he claimed he'd never actually seen the creature, but how it simultaneously was a huge influence on his life, which is kind of perpendicular to his account that this creature had been messing with the family for decades. Now, regardless, the creature's rise to fame was accompanied by more sightings of both it and its big feet, with the creature being seen crossing roads and jumping from bridges in the 1970s through the 1980s. And there was even a gas station owner who saw the creature's footprints lining a soybean field in the area, although the local game warden was extremely skeptical of the footprints' authenticity. The matter of foot shape is also probably one of the larger points against the monster's authenticity. To start, the original 1971 casts of the feet revealed them to be long and thin. For the record, most large animals have rather wide feet to support their weight. Additionally, the number of toes were sort of weird and differed from other Bigfoot variants, with 3 long, thin toes being present on the creature's feet that went straight out rather than going outward. If these footprints were authentic, this creature would be the only primate with 3 toes, or even identical toes. Now, regardless of the skepticism surrounding the existence of this critter, the community loves and supports their own personal cryptid, and the Boggy Bottom Monster has its own festival attributed to it, the Fouke Monster Festival, that's held in Fouke every year. This celebration has been held since 2013, and it discusses folklore related to the monster and other local cryptids, with proceeds benefiting the local school district. Frankly, I can't be upset with this. It's good fun, and it even benefits a good cause. So if any of y'all are from Fouke, Arkansas, or have been in the area, have you seen the Fouke Monster? Are there still tales of it bouncing around? If you've heard any recently, let me know in the comments below. Now, I don't know what kind of scrambled egg brain I have, but never, and I mean never, did I think Little Rock, Arkansas was actually named after, wait for it, a literal little rock. Like, are you kidding me? Not some historical titan named Sir Roxworth Little? Nope, just a rock, a small one at that. The story goes like this. Back in 1722, French explorer Jean-Baptiste Bernard de la Harpe, yes, that's a full name, was cruising up the Arkansas River on an expedition from the mouth of the Mississippi. At some point during this adventure, he supposedly spotted a small stone outcropping on the river's bank and dubbed it La Petite Roche, the Little Rock. You know why he did this? Well, supposedly, it's because this was the first rock he saw. Bro, you've got to be lying. You traveled hundreds of miles through some of the rockiest riverbanks you could imagine, and saw one mediocre little rock, and you were like, voila, is the first rock. Bro, there are rocks everywhere around here. I've been to Arkansas. Okay, sorry, I'm fired up. Anyways, early settlers rolled with it, even if it were a dumb as a box of rocks origin story. An 1822 article in the Arkansas Gazette, for instance, described this humble bump in the bank as jutting out several feet into the river, forming a natural basin that was convenient for boats. Its top reached about halfway between the Arkansas's low water mark and the top of the bank, so it was, well, noticeable, I guess. At least enough for 1800s boat guys to get excited. Fast forward to the 1870s, the rock got its moment of fame, and then tragedy struck. In 1872, most of it was blown to bits to make room for a bridge that was never even finished. Yup, they destroyed Arkansas's namesake for a bridge they didn't even manage to complete. Absolute heartbreak. But I guess this explains why this Little Rock is the naming of Little Rock. At least it was a little bit bigger before. Regardless, a real bridge finally did come along in the 1880s, built by the Little Rock Junction Railway. And it rests on what's left of the rock, now mostly buried beneath concrete, steel, and the crushing weight of historical irony. So yeah, that's Little Rock, named after an actual little rock, a rock that got chopped up, largely buried, and forgotten by all but a few plaques and a city of people who mostly, I don't even think, know it exists. Something about this is poetic, and I just can't place it. You know how most monster stories go. A blurry photo, a suspiciously anonymous source, and a guy who once saw Bigfoot fight Elvis behind a Waffle House. But then, there's the White River Monster, a cryptid that, against all odds, I actually think is real. This slippery legend hails from the White River, which snakes through northeastern Arkansas and eventually feeds into the mighty Mississippi. It's a river with history. Back in the Civil War days, it was a key route for moving supplies. That is, if you believe the legends, until something big, really big, allegedly flipped a boat during transport. This, according to some, was the first run-in with the White River Monster. Now, the first official, aka written down, monster report came on July 1st of 1915, when a plantation owner near Newport, Arkansas, caught sight of something hulking in the river. He said it was gray-skinned and as wide as a car, and about 3 cars long. Naturally, the town's response was, "Let's catch this sucker with a giant rope net." Side note, they ran out of funds though before they could actually build this rope net. Fast forward to 1937 and things get fishier. Literally. Local fishermen started griping that they couldn't catch anything. And then, of course, they saw something that gave them a reason for their lack of catching fish. Bramlett Bateman, another plantation owner, saw it first. He described this creature as having the skin of an elephant and the face of a catfish. The creature was, and this is a partial quote, just floating there, lolling on the water, crusty skin and all. Over the next few months, Bateman and many others, including a deputy sheriff, reported seeing the creature, and a woman named Ethel even claimed she'd spotted it 13 years earlier, having been drawn to it by the strange blowing noise it made. Bateman, the plantation owner, convinced this catfish-elephant hybrid was a threat to his crops, don't ask how, just go with it, decided he wanted to drop TNT into the river to take care of it. But thankfully, local fish and wildlife officials said, maybe don't do that, and the monster lived to lurk another day. But that didn't stop monster hunters from showing up with nets. Divers would come, people would bring cameras, and allegedly someone brought a light machine gun. Luckily, apparently this monster knew he was in danger because the monster ghosted everyone, just like Michaela did to me when I was 13. I still remember that, Michaela. But regardless of my woes, the beast wasn't done yet. In 1971, the White River Monster, or possibly its spawn, made a triumphant comeback. This time, apparently looking like a boxcar with smooth, peeling skin and possibly a horn growing out of its forehead. Also, according to eyewitnesses, it made a sound somewhere between a cow's moo and a horse's neigh, because apparently, this thing is part sea creature, part barnyard. Even better, it left 3-toed footprints, each a solid 14 inches long, along the shoreline, and that was enough for Arkansas lawmakers to step up and do something that only Arkansas lawmakers would ever think to do. They passed an actual law declaring a section of the White River a White River Monster Refuge. As long as the monster stayed between Rosie and the old Grand Glaze, portions of the river, it was protected by the state. Monster retirement plan secured. Frankly, though, it wasn't hurting anyone. So yeah, I say protect it too. Anyways, with this seemingly sort of crazy story laid out, what the heck was this creature? Enter the scientists and skeptics. To start, biologist Roy McCall, who usually plays for Team Loch Ness, suggested maybe, just maybe, it was an elephant seal. Except, yeah, elephant seals do not hang out in Arkansas, like ever. They're mostly found along the west coast of the continent. Then, Joe Nickel of the Skeptical Inquirer piped up and said, how about a Florida manatee? And you know what? That actually makes a disturbing amount of sense. Let's walk through this. Manatees are huge. Some grow up to 15 feet and weigh over 3,600 pounds. That's heavier than your average Toyota Corolla. They have smooth gray skin. They can make blowing noises. They are well known to be good long-distance swimmers and have been observed as far north as near Memphis, Tennessee. They can live, easily in fact, in both fresh and salt water, and they even have 3 flipper toes. And sometimes they haul themselves onto land to nibble at plants, although I may be misled in this fact. I, for the life of me, couldn't find any videos or photos of manatees even partially on shore that were alive. Now, there are some caveats. For instance, manatees don't technically have horns, but it's been speculated that the horn people saw might have been a misinterpreted snout or just a fluke of lighting and river gunk, or possibly the nails on the creature's toes. So in conclusion, surprisingly, the white river monster probably exists. No, it's not here to flip your boat or steal your crops, but rather it might just be a very lost and very chonky manatee, doing its best in an unfamiliar river system. But hey, even if this is just a southern fried sea cow with a PR problem, it's now a legally protected southern fried sea cow. Tucked into the quiet hills near Cushman in Independence County, Arkansas, lies a cave that at first glance might not seem much different from any other in the Ozarks. Its entrance is modest, the kind you could miss if you weren't looking for it. But if you stand near its mouth, you'll hear a low, persistent roar, like distant thunder or rushing wind, or maybe water, echoing up from the dark. That's where this cave gets its name. Blowing Cave. The sound, in actuality, is caused by air being pushed through the cave's twisting passages, creating a haunting, almost unnatural blowing effect. During the Great Depression, this place was a local oddity, a natural attraction where people would come to explore, picnic, and pass time. Also, they would hold parties here during the Great Depression, I kid you not. But that's all this cave is, right? Just a quirky geological feature. Well, not exactly. See, most caves in the Ozarks don't end up the center of wild theories, whispered legends, and underground civilizations. Blowing Cave, for reasons still sort of unclear, became the epicenter of one of the strangest, most persistent stories in all of American fringe lore. If the accounts are to be believed, and that's a big if, then this unassuming Arkansas cave might just be hiding a secret civilization, one occupied by beings not entirely human, some with chalky blue skin and others that are nearly 8 feet tall. Sounds sort of crazy, right? Well, it happened. It all begins with a man named Richard Shaver, a science fiction writer who in the early 1940s sent a letter to Amazing Stories magazine. And in that letter, Shaver claimed he had uncovered an ancient lost language named Mantong, hidden in plain sight within modern English. Each letter, he said, had a symbolic meaning, and when decoded, revealed hidden truths about human history. The editor of Amazing Stories, Ray Palmer, was the kind of guy who loved a good mystery, or at least a good story, and instead of brushing it off, Palmer encouraged Shaver to expand his ideas into a full-length story. And what followed between 1945 and 1948 were several deeply strange but wildly popular stories printed in the magazine. Stories that Shaver insisted were not fiction, but true accounts of what he had discovered beneath the surface of the Earth. At the heart of Shaver's claims was the idea that the Earth had once been inhabited by a race of advanced beings called the Murrians, descendants of an ancient civilization that, long ago, fled underground to escape the sun's increasing radiation. And where did they flee underground? Well, one of the few remaining entrances, it's said, was through modern-day Blowing Cave in Arkansas. Regardless, over centuries, these beings split into two factions. The Teros, who were benevolent, wise protectors who valued peace and knowledge and watched over humans, and the Deros, degenerates who were violent entities driven by madness and cruelty towards humans. According to Shaver, the Deros still dwell below, using ancient Lemurian machines to manipulate humanity, controlling minds, causing disease, and even abducting surface dwellers for experimentation. These beings, he said, were the source of countless myths, demons, trolls, aliens, and even gods, and even Satan himself. In contrast, the Teros, though less visible, worked to counterbalance the evil, doing their best to protect humans from the shadows. And here's the kicker. All of this drama that Shaver said was going on under Blowing Cave, he claimed he didn't just imagine this. He said he remembered it as part of a past life. He described massive subterranean cities connected by tunnels stretching across the globe, and that the beings that lived here spoke Mantong, stood up to 8 feet tall as they said, and bore strange skin. He described massive subterranean cities connected by tunnels stretching across the globe that were inhabited by these Teros and Deros, although most of them at this point were Deros. Again, these were his first-hand memories from a past life as one of these creatures. And of course, throughout all of these stories, he was insistent that all of this was occurring inside of Blowing Cave. And eventually, my impression is that he actually said that he visited it at one point. He said he entered this underground realm through a hidden passage in the cave, right here in the hills of Arkansas. And there he allegedly encountered both of these races, the Taros and Daros, saw their machines, and witnessed their strange society firsthand. Palmer, of course, loved this and published every word by Shaver, and these stories exploded in popularity. The issues of Amazing Stories featuring Shaver's accounts sold out nationwide, at least initially. Reader clubs would form, letters would flood in, some skeptical and some claiming similar experiences. And regarding these similar experiences, trust me, they're not exactly sparse. Among those who believed, or at least claimed to, was a man named George D. Wright. He reportedly explored Blowing Cave himself, and came back with tales that mirrored Shaver's, describing a vast network of tunnels and encounters with the same towering humanoids. Decades later, author Bruce Allen Walton, writing under the name Branton, included Blowing Cave in his book The Underground Empire, where he described eerily similar experiences, massive beings, hidden cities, and strange lights. In Walton's version, the beings were human-like, but unnaturally tall, again around 7 or 8 feet in height, but he stopped short of naming them Taros or Daros, but the resemblance was hard to ignore. These tales helped cement Blowing Cave's status as a kind of underground Roswell, a place where legends and paranoia merged. Today, Shaver's stories are probably rightfully viewed by scholars and skeptics as pulp fiction with a twist at best, strange tales perhaps amplified by mental illness or creative license. Shaver did, after all, say much of his information came from remembered past lives and psychic impressions, not exactly peer-reviewed material. Still, the influence of this folklore is undeniable. Modern UFO lore, the kind that talks about underground alien bases in Antarctica, the mountains of Alaska, or beneath oceans, owes a huge debt to Shaver. His was one of the first widely distributed narratives that proposed the idea of hostile underground civilizations influencing humanity. You see echoes of his ideas in everything from the X-Files to conspiracy message boards. And as for Blowing Cave itself, it's beautiful, no question. Inside, you'll find striking underground formations, rushing water, and a sense of eerie silence that only deep caves can provide. But if you follow the cave's mapped route, you'll hit a dead end. Around 1.4 miles in, the passage either becomes too narrow to continue, or simply stops. There aren't any confirmed offshoots. No hidden doors, no glowing cities, just stone and darkness. Still, that hasn't stopped people from believing. Some visitors swear they feel something down there. A presence, a pressure, a whisper in the dark. If you're curious enough to visit, know this. Blowing Cave sits on private land. The landowners reportedly allow access, but only if you get their permission first. So don't go snooping around without it. The area is regularly patrolled. Also, they do offer guided tours, so your best bet if you want to visit Blowing Cave is to go with a licensed tour guide. Besides, a safe adventure is always better than an illegal one. And hey, if you do happen to wander a little too far and run into an 8-foot-tall being with chalky skin, tell them T sent you, and give them a high five. Back in the 1890s, before UFOs ejected men wearing shiny silver suits and blasting synth music, the skies were haunted by something just as weird. Giant, creaky, steampunk-looking airships floating mysteriously across America's skies. Victorian UFOs, complete with propellers, blinking lights powered by who knows what, but sometimes men on bicycles, and even the occasional cigar-smoking gentleman waving from the deck. These things were spotted all over, from California to Illinois, long before actual airships were a thing. Newspapers were flooded with wild tales of flying machines zipping around like futuristic zeppelins, decades before the Wright brothers even said, "Let's try flying." What made these sightings especially juicy was how impossibly ahead of their time they were. People described technology that didn't even exist, piloted by strange inventors who'd sometimes land, chat politely, and then float away like sky wizards. Some claimed to see Martians. Others blamed secret inventors testing anti-gravity engines. The whole saga feels like a fever dream wrapped in a Jules Verne novel, and it's fascinating because it blurs the line between mass delusion, early science fiction, and genuine mystery. And of course, among this drama, Arkansas had its moment front and center. By the spring of 1897, the airship craze had made its way to Arkansas. bringing with it a whole mess of confusion, and an alarming number of polite strangers in goggles. On April 20th, Captain Jim Houghton, a railroad conductor, hunter, and accidental extraterrestrial diplomat, stumbled into history while tromping through the woods outside of Texarkana. Now, Houghton wasn't the type to get flustered. He wrangled steam engines for a living, after all. But when he heard what sounded like a locomotive huffing and puffing deep in the brush, he knew something was off, mainly because locomotives don't typically go gallivanting through the underbrush like deer. He crept closer, expecting maybe a derailed train, or at least some heavily confused cattle. But instead, he found a full-on airship, right there in a field, as if it had just parallel parked next to a stand of oak trees. The thing was massive and metallic, and standing nearby like a bouncer at an intergalactic speakeasy was a man wearing smoke-colored glasses. This guy wasn't shocked to see Houghton. He just stood there, cool as a cucumber in a silk waistcoat. Houghton, in true Arkansas fashion, approached the bizarre craft with a mix of curiosity and manners. "Is this an airship?" he asked, as if he were inquiring about a new model of tractor. "Yes, sir," the man replied, probably adjusting his mysterious goggles for dramatic effect. A few more crew members strolled out from inside the vessel, nonchalant as could be. Houghton, whose brain was probably trying to balance the laws of physics with the reality of what he was seeing, noted that the machine sounded suspiciously like a Westinghouse air brake. When he asked, the man confirmed they were using compressed air and aeroplanes, whatever that means, but added cryptically, "You will know more later on." Then they just got back aboard and took off into the sky like it wasn't a big deal that an airship was sitting in the woods in rural Arkansas. But Arkansas was just getting warmed up. 2 weeks later, on May 7th, a couple of police officers were out on a soggy night patrol near Hot Springs. Constable John Sumter and Deputy John McLemore were the kind of officers who weren't easily spooked. They were armed, they were on horseback, and used to dealing with bootleggers and black bears, but they were not prepared for glowing sky cigars in the slightest. They first noticed a strange light flickering in the rain-drenched sky, then again, much lower, hovering like a gigantic lightning bug. Their horses took one look and decided, nope, and they refused to go another step further, so the officers dismounted and crept forward, weapons drawn, because, again, this is Arkansas, and even unidentified flying objects aren't immune to a little Second Amendment skepticism. What they saw was a 60-foot-long cigar-shaped ship, glowing in the dark, which settled quietly on the wet ground. Men were milling around it, filling up sacks with water like they were just out on a midnight camping trip. And when questioned, one of the men, a bearded fellow with a lantern, who had the confidence of someone who's done this before, explained they were simply traveling across the country in their airship. No big deal. He even offered the officers a ride on it, saying he could take them somewhere where it wasn't raining. That's customer service you don't even get on Delta. The lawmen declined with an extremely Arkansas response. "We told them we believed we preferred to get wet." After this, they said okay, and the ship floated off. And if you believe the story, the occupants said they were bound for Nashville, leaving behind 2 damp officers with a story that sounded like the constables may have had a little too much fun at the bar that evening. It's worth noting this wasn't just backwoods patrolmen seeing these things. The Arkansas legislature officially took notice, too. Lawmakers, mid-debate over Railroad Commission issues, realized something crucial. These flying contraptions were zipping around carrying passengers, cargo, and weirdos in glasses, and they weren't paying a lick of taxes. Now that is some proper Uncle Sam spirit. The Senate passed a tongue-in-cheek, but I'm sure sort of serious resolution demanding these mystery airships pay freight taxes like any other legitimate transportation service. It's the only known time in U.S. history where an unidentified flying object was officially declared a delinquent taxpayer. Then, after decades of silence, the skies got twitchy again in 1965, although admittedly this time flying aircraft did exist, so that's a step towards things being more grounded, I suppose. August of 1965 brought another wave of reports. In Viney Grove, Bill Estep spotted what he later described as a long, narrow silver object, with windows and a spinning light on top. Naturally, he went to investigate because nothing says excellent life choices like approaching a hovering alien disco stick. He described it hanging eerily above the treetops, pulsing out light. Meanwhile, over in Fort Smith, up to 1,500 people reported seeing strange craft buzzing around the city. It was enough to trigger an investigation by Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO task force, and unofficial UFO party poopers. While the official verdict was probably swamp gas or temperature inversions, nobody could quite explain how that many people hallucinated the same glowing blimp. Since then, sightings have slowed but never stopped. In fact, they've become part of the state's folklore. Groups like MUFON and NICAP keep tabs on local reports, and every April, believers and skeptics alike gather in Eureka Springs for the Ozark Mountain UFO Conference, a place where you can listen to ex-Air Force pilots, conspiracy theorists, and local ranchers all agree that something weird happened in 1897 and is maybe still happening. Although from what I can tell, the blimp sightings aren't so frequent anymore. Anyways, if you live in Arkansas and you've seen something strange in the sky, you gotta let me know in the comments, or shoot me an email and tell me your story. I'd love to hear it. Arkansas, I had a heck of a time here with you, and I hope you enjoyed learning a tiny bit about the lore in your state. Now, if you want more stories for your state, or just more of this series in general, drop a comment below and let me know what you want to see next. Also, hey, if you enjoyed the ride, hitting like and subscribing helps me get one step closer to my goal of 100,000 subs in 2025. Seriously, it's free, quick, and lets YouTube know that this is the kind of content you'd like to see more of. So as for what's next, I need to wrap up Alabama and Georgia, and along the way, I've got a Dark Places episode for the Florida Everglades slated, if that sounds interesting to you, and I might throw in a part 2 for Florida or South Carolina, or maybe even North Carolina too. Maybe I should just part 2 everybody in the Southeast before moving on. Regardless, we're going to wrap up the Southeast, and then we're going to head to the Northeastern USA before we head out west. Anyways, that's the plan. Now, despite this, remember, most importantly, whether you just saw a tall blue man crawl out of Blowing Cave, or if your local pastor started saying inflammatory things about another nearby church, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.